Hey there, AP World students. This is Mr. Everton, and this is a video about changes in power after 1900. We're going to be talking about things that are happening basically before, during, and after World War I. So it's, this could have happened. We could have done this video before World War I. We're choosing to do it after. And we're going to be contextualizing political changes in Asia during the early 20th century. So we used this map a long time ago, back in Unit 3, when we talked about land-based empires. And since we talked about them in our course, both the Safavid Empire and the Mughal Empire have ceased to exist. And today we're going to kill off the remaining three: the Russian Empire in northern Asia, the Qing Empire, or the Qing Dynasty, which is in Eastern Asia, and then the Ottoman Empire, which is in Southwest Asia, or the Middle East. So the big idea for today is that we have these land-based empires that have existed for a really long time, hundreds of years, all of them. And in the early 20th century, all three of them collapsed due to a variety of internal and external factors. So we're talking about the end of an empire. What are the kinds of internal factors that cause an empire to fall? What are the kind of external factors that cause an empire to fall? And in this particular case, in the early 20th century, most of these factors are going to involve industrialization. Industrialization is the big event of the 19th century that is going to, it took a while, it didn't happen overnight, but all three of these empires, to some extent, are destroyed by their response to industrialization. So let's start with the Qing Dynasty. We've already talked about the Qing Dynasty a bit, the decline of the Qing Dynasty a bit. This is review, right? But we talked about one internal cause, which was the rebellions, the Taiping Rebellion and the Boxer Rebellion, which were these massive internal conflicts where peasants revolted against the Qing Dynasty and millions of people were killed during the 19th century. We also talked about European aggression against China. Remember when we talked about the Opium Wars, where Britain wanted to have access to Chinese markets and couldn't get it. And so they began trading opium illegally with the people of China. And then, they fought a war against China to ensure their ability to sell opium and forced the Qing Dynasty to sign a series of really lopsided treaties, giving the British and then other European powers access to parts of China. We call these spheres of influence. So they're not colonies per se, but they're places in China where European powers have control over parts of China, not a full-fledged colony. And then another problem that the Qing Dynasty faced that we haven't talked about really is ethnic tensions between the Manchus, who the Qing Dynasty are Manchurian. They come from an area north of China called Manchuria. And they have ethnic tension with the dominant ethnic group of China, who are the Han Chinese. And so that tension is another contributing factor. And then the failure of the self-strengthening movement. So during the late Qing Dynasty, there were people in the Qing government who recognized the importance of industrialization and trying to modernize China and to bring its economy and its military up to speed with what was going on in Europe and try to make China a modern country that could compete with European powers. And that failed. And so that's another internal reason for the decline of the Qing Dynasty. So following all of that, in 1911, there was a revolution. It was led by a man named Sun Yat-sen, who you can see in this black and white photo, the man with the mustache and the suit. Notice he's wearing traditional Western clothing because he's a proponent of modernization. And he's a leader of a group in China called the Kuomintang, who are the Nationalist Party of China. So nationalism comes to China. Sun Yat-sen gets the final Qing emperor, who's a boy, to step down. And this is the end of the dynastic system in China. So for going back thousands of years, China has been ruled by a dynasty, an emperor and their family. And now that cycle is over, and China is now a republic, the Republic of China, starting in 1911. This also, going along with this, was a rejection of Confucianism, which was the traditional belief system of China that the civil service system that, produced Chinese bureaucrats and government officials. They were all produced by the civil service system, and their knowledge, and that tested their knowledge of Confucianism. So that was rejected and abolished. In the period after Sun Yat-sen established the Republic of China in the 1920s, before that, a communist party developed in China led by Mao Zedong, and the nationalists tried to purge the government of communists, leading to a civil war in China and a period of instability and violence that began in the late 1920s and lasted up until 1949. And in 1949, Mao Zedong, the communist leader of China, solidified control over China and established a communist government that would run China for the next 50-some years. So that's China, oversimplified and very much in a nutshell. This flag that you see, that's a picture of Mao Zedong on the right, wearing the gray, with the and then down below that those two flags on the right, you see the flag of communist China, and on the left you see the flag of the Nationalist Party, the Nationalist Chinese flag. So now we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about the Ottoman Empire, which had been in decline going back to the 1700s. The Ottomans were incredibly powerful for a while. They created a massive land-based empire. They were really like the star of Unit 3, right? Like they were like the empire par excellence. But they started to decline gradually at first, and then more significantly during the 1800s. For a long time, they were known as the sick man of Europe. I think I'm contractually obliged to tell you that the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe. When you think about what a sick person is like, they're not able to do the things that healthy people are able to do, right? They're weak. The Ottoman Empire became weaker and weaker and weaker over the course of the 19th century. Part of that is down to nationalism, which is another important trend in units 5 and 6, is nationalism. And you have nationalist movements that begin to disrupt the Ottoman Empire. They start to lose important parts of the Ottoman Empire, like Egypt. Egypt has a nationalist party that's interested in creating an Egyptian country. Greece has a nationalist party that is interested and does break away from the Ottoman Empire. And you start to have elements within Turkey, which is like the heart of the Ottoman Empire, that are Turkish nationalists who are disagreeing with the way that that the Ottoman Empire has been doing business. Those are all internal problems. Then you end up with aggression from the West, which is similar to what we talked about just a minute ago. In this instance, it takes the form of the Crimean War, where the Russian Empire is interested in establishing control over ports in the Black Sea so that it can have a warm water port that it can connect it to the Mediterranean. And so the Russian Empire tries to take land away from the Ottomans. And the only reason why the Ottomans are able to even prevent the Russians from being successful is because they have the support of Britain and France in that particular war. So the Ottomans recognize that they're having a hard time, in part because they have not industrialized, they have not modernized. And so they began something called the Tanzimat reforms in an attempt to modernize. And without going into all the details of that, they failed, and they were unable to modernize and successfully industrialize the Ottoman Empire. So that leads to, then we get to World War I. The Ottomans are on the losing side of World War I, one of the central powers. And after World War I is over, they dissolve. Much of their territory is broken up under what's called the Mandate System. This is a map of the Middle East under the Mandate System. You can see that the modern country of Iraq and the modern country of Jordan, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, these are all territories. These are all modern countries whose borders are predominantly determined by European powers who imposed these boundaries on this region without really taking into account the kinds of ethnic groups that lived there. I know that you took AP Human Geography and that you learned about Kurdistan and how the Kurds are a nation with no state, right? Like they're a group, an ethnic group that has no country to represent themselves, and they represent parts of Turkey and northern Iraq and Syria. Another important aspect of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire is what happens with Turkey under their most celebrated leader, whose name is Mustafa Kemal, who often is sometimes referred to as Ataturk, who was the first leader of modern Turkey. Turkey, was originally kind of the heart of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Turks were, who the Ottoman Empire were named for. Mustafa Kemal led a Turkish nationalist movement that was very focused on modernization and trying to make Turkey a modern country. He was not interested in democracy. He established himself as an absolutist dictator who would have control over Turkey and not be subject to like a democratic election. And he was very focused on secularism and removing the centrality of Islam. His government was not a religious government, and he moved to modernize Turkey. Again, you can see that the man is wearing European clothing. He's wearing a suit and tie. And he would, for example, he took the Hagia Sophia, which was this celebrated cathedral that had been turned into a mosque. He went and turned that into a museum. So that's an example of the secularism of modern Turkey. He's trying to move away from Islam and make the government of Turkey a non-religious one in the style of a modern European country. Finally, we're going to talk about the decline and fall of the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire, this map shows the expansion of the Russian Empire dating back to 1462, when it began basically, as a group of princes who sort of solidified around the city of Moscow and began to grow, and in a process very similar to what happened with the United States. The United States started off as British colonies that then expanded westward across a continent until it reached the Pacific Ocean. The Russian Empire began as a small country in Eastern Europe that then expanded eastward across the Asian continent until it reached the Pacific Ocean. So an external factor that led to the decline and fall of the Russian Empire was its failure in two different wars. The Crimean War that I talked about earlier, where the Russians got their butts kicked by the British and the French, who were helping out the Ottoman Empire. And then also the Russo-Japanese War, which we talked about in an earlier lecture, where the newly modernized and industrialized Japanese state was able to handily defeat the Russians in 1905. So the Russians were embarrassed in the middle of the 1800s in the Crimean War, and then in 1905 they were really embarrassed when they were beat by the Japanese, who they thought of as like being unsophisticated, East Asians, like not Europeans, like how could they beat us? And they got their butts kicked. So they were very upset about that. The peasants were extremely unhappy. The peasants were not particularly well treated. They didn't have enough food to eat. And in 1905, in part because of the loss in the Russo-Japanese War, there was a massive rebellion that was put down through force. But the Russian government, led by Tsar Nicholas II, who you see pictured here with his family, caved in to some of their demands and created a Russian legislature called the Duma. That would not be enough to save the Russian Empire. They had, once again, a familiar theme, they had failed to industrialize. They had not been able to keep up with Europe. And that's the reason why they lost the Crimean and the Russo-Japanese wars in the first place, because they hadn't kept up with the industrialization that the rest of Europe had been engaged in. They'd done some, like we talked about the Trans-Siberian Railway, but they didn't do enough. And also then, they were faced with the human and economic costs of World War I, which was incredibly unpopular in Russia. The Eastern Front was the part of World War I that was fought between Germany and Russia on the eastern border of Germany. And, There were extremely high casualties on both sides. There were many dead Russian soldiers with families who mourned them, and there was an incredible amount of money that was spent trying to defeat Germany. And people became very upset. And all of this led in 1917 to a revolution. And the reason why this one is the biggest deal is because this led to the first communist state in world history. So we talked about Marxism and socialism and communism. Here's a definition of communism just to remind you. Communism is a political and economic doctrine that aims to replace private property and a profit-based economy. So get rid of capitalism. Nobody owns any private property anymore, and replace it with public ownership and communal control of at least the major parts of production. So like the government owns the important parts of the economy, like the mines and the mills and the factories. Take away private ownership, give it to the government, a command economy. So in 1917, Tsar Nicholas II was deposed, and there was a fairly weak government that took control of Russia in February of that year. But by the fall, that government fell, and the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, pictured here, rose to power and took over Russia, instituting a communist government. There were groups. I'm sorry, it's been a long week. So there were groups called Soviets that made up the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which is what USSR stands for. A lot of times we just call it the Soviet Union. You can also refer to it as Soviet Russia. It's important that you know that from 1917 until 1989, Russia became the USSR, or the Soviet Union. There was a massive civil war that took place after the Bolsheviks and Vladimir Lenin came to power in 1917. The Bolsheviks were the Red Army, and they had to fight against a group called the White Army that was supported by both the British and the United States. Many people who talk about the Cold War have started to talk about the Cold War beginning even as early as 1918, 1919, and 1920, when the United States government sent soldiers to go try to undermine the Soviet Union in its earliest stages. The Bolsheviks were able to win this civil war, following which Lenin instituted something called his new economic policy, where he sort of pulled back a little bit from true communism and tried to carve out some exemptions in the rules of no private property. He let some small businesses keep their property in an attempt to appease the peasants and the general public. That would all be completely undone when he died in 1924, and his successor, Joseph Stalin, took control of the Soviet Union and took it in a different direction, which we will talk more about in class. So what I would like for you to do now, on campus, I want for you to write an introductory paragraph for an essay comparing the fall of two of these land-based empires. If it were me, I'll just be straight with you. If it were me, I think it would be easiest to do the Qing and the Ottoman. You can use the Soviet Union if you want to. I feel like that one, there's too much there. It's a little bit more complicated. If I was writing this paragraph, I would do it about the Qing and the Ottomans. But you have the choice. You do what you want. You're going to write an introductory paragraph as though you were writing an essay comparing the fall of these two land-based empires, which means you need to have contextualization to start your paragraph. So what trends in world history contributed to the fall of these empires? What is something that we talked about in Unit 6 or in Unit 5 that helped to cause these empires to fall? And, so start your paragraph off talking about that, the context, the background, and then identify 3 topics of discussion in your thesis statement. So your paragraph should end with a thesis statement that identifies 3 topics of discussion. And each topic should be a similarity or a difference that you would be able to write an entire body paragraph about. Let me know if you have questions. You can email them to me. And I hope you have a good rest of your weekend. I hope this doesn't take you too long. I feel like I talked for a long time. Sorry. Sometimes it's like that.